It was a quiet village, the kind where everyone knew each other. Nothing unusual ever happened in Hayfield. That is, until the masked man arrived. He appeared out of nowhere, one evening at sunset, walking down the main road. He wore a plain, featureless white mask that covered his entire face, with no visible openings for his eyes or mouth. He didn't speak. He didn't interact with anyone. He just walked. At first, people were curious, maybe even amused. But as night fell and the man continued to wander the streets, unease settled in. No one knew where he'd come from, and more disturbingly, no one knew where he was going. The next morning, he was gone. But whispers spread quickly. Something felt wrong in Hayfield. The village tried to forget about the masked man. People went about their business, convincing themselves it was just a strange, passing event. But that very night, something happened. Old Mrs. Carver's house, which had stood at the edge of town for nearly a century, burned to the ground. No one knew how the fire had started, and no one had seen anything, except for one witness. "I saw him," said Marcus, a local shopkeeper. "The man with the mask. He was standing outside the house, watching it burn." People wanted to believe Marcus was mistaken, but deep down, everyone felt it. This wasn't a coincidence. The masked man was tied to it, somehow. And then, just as before, he disappeared. Days passed, and the village fell into a strange silence. The once lively streets were quieter than usual, as if people were too afraid to speak aloud. They were all waiting for something, though none dared to say what. The masked man returned again a few nights later, as if nothing had happened. He walked through the streets, passing house after house, his presence an eerie reminder that things were not as they seemed. This time, no one dared confront him, but there was an unspoken understanding that something terrible would follow. By morning, the village awoke to find the church bell missing, a massive, heavy structure, stolen in the dead of night without a sound. People whispered about the masked man, though no one had seen him take it. The tension in the village grew unbearable. People stayed indoors, locking their doors and windows at night, fearing the return of the masked man. He had become a symbol of something they couldn't explain, a shadow hanging over the town. Then, young Tommy Patterson disappeared. He had been playing in the fields with his friends that afternoon. They had only turned their backs for a moment, they said. But when they looked again, Tommy was gone. His parents searched the fields, the woods, everywhere. But he had vanished without a trace. The only thing anyone saw was the masked man, once again wandering the streets that evening. This time, people began to panic. Tommy's disappearance couldn't be a coincidence. They were sure of it. The masked man was responsible. But how? The fear had turned to anger. The villagers decided they could no longer sit by and watch their home be torn apart by this silent, faceless stranger. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a group of men gathered in the village square, armed with anything they could find: pitchforks, hammers, even torches. They planned to confront the masked man and demand answers. And sure enough, as darkness fell, he appeared. The men surrounded him, blocking his path. "What do you want from us?" shouted one of them. "What have you done with Tommy?" another demanded. But the masked man didn't speak. He simply stood there, his head slowly tilting from one side to the other, as if considering them. The silence stretched on, unbearable, until suddenly he moved. With unnatural speed, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the men standing there, stunned and helpless. The villagers were still reeling from the masked man's disappearance the night before, unsure of what would happen next. Early the next morning, as dawn broke, a scream echoed through the square. It was Tommy's mother. She had found something outside her home, a white mask, identical to the one the stranger wore. But this mask was different. It was smeared in blood, and on its surface, a message had been written in jagged, red letters. "He was never yours." The blood, it was Tommy's. The villagers were horrified. Some collapsed in shock, others stood frozen in place. It was then that they realized the truth. The masked man hadn't come to terrorize the town. He had come to claim what he believed belonged to him. The village was never the same after that. Most people left within days, unwilling to live in a place marked by such horror. But Tommy was never found. And the masked man? He was never seen again. But the blood-stained mask remained, a haunting reminder of the boy they'd lost.